We're continuing in our reading of the Quran. We're in the second surah, ayahs 113 through 121. And we've reached the point where I see the first major difference between Islam and Christianity. Now, I have pointed out to you guys when the Quran reminds me of something I've learned in my faith tradition. And now that I'm finding things that are different, I'm going to tell you that too. But first, we start in verse 113, where it describes the Jews saying Christians have nothing to stand on, and Christians saying the exact same thing about the Jews. The text says, even though they both received the scripture. Now, rather than settling that argument, the Quran says that God will judge between them concerning their disagreement. And I found that interesting because as humans, sometimes we seem awfully confident about deciding who God's going to accept and who he's not. But this verse leaves the ultimate judgment to God. Then verse 114 condemns people who prevent God's name from being spoken in places of worship or who seek to destroy those places. And that made me think about things that are going on around the United States and especially in my home state of Texas, where we have people and cities that are trying to prevent mosques from being built and people from practicing their faith of Islam. So that seemed rather timely to what's going on in current events right now. But then immediately after that verse comes one of my favorite lines from this section. It says, "To God belong the east and the west. Wherever you turn, there is the faith of God." And I immediately heard echoes from my own faith tradition because I know the verses that say, the heaven declares the glory of God. And where can I flee from God's presence? The idea that creation itself bears witness to the Creator. They're different sacred texts, but that idea seemed very familiar to me. And then I got to ayah 116. And here is where Christianity and Islam genuinely part ways. Because Christians confess Jesus as the Son of God and in Orthodox Christianity as divine. The Quran rejects divine sonship. It responds that everything in heaven and earth belong to God. And then the next ayah says that God is the originator of the heavens and earth. When God decrees something, he says be, and it is. Now, I'm not going to try to make those two theological positions agree because they don't. And the purpose of this journey isn't to decide which religion is right and which is wrong. My purpose is much simpler. What does the Quran actually say? And here it says something that conflicts with a central Christian belief. Then we go to verse 118 and it returns to something that we have encountered repeatedly. When the people ask, why doesn't God speak to us directly? Or why won't God just give us another sign? And the Quran says that people that came before asked the same questions. Now that actually helped me understand an earlier verse we talked about last time, and all of your comments helped me understand it too, about the warning about questioning the messenger. So I don't think the problem is don't ask sincere questions. I think the warning is about continually demanding one more sign or one more proof or one more condition before we're ready to respond. Then we get to verse 119, which tells Muhammad that he has been sent with truth as a bearer of good news and a warner. He's responsible for delivering the message, but he is not responsible for controlling how everyone responds to the message. And then verse 120 gets even more direct. It says that Jews and Christians will not be satisfied with Muhammad until he follows their religious way. But Muhammad is told to follow what he understands to be God's guidance rather than changing it to get the approval of some other religious community. And then I reached verse 121, and it's a tough one because it speaks of those who were given the book, who received or recited it as it should be received. But then in the Quran's argument, there's a challenging implication here. It says if earlier scripture really came from God, and this revelation also comes from God, then someone who faithfully received the earlier revelation should be able to recognize God's continuing revelation. And as someone raised as a Christian who's reading the Quran for the first time, I think I understand the claim the Quran is making here, and it's not comfortable. but we're not going to shy away from verses just because they make me uncomfortable. The Quran seems to be saying that if I take my own scripture seriously, but don't recognize Muhammad as a messenger of God, then the Quran presents me with a difficult question. Am I truly understanding the revelation I already have? Now listen carefully to what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that the Quran's claim is true. I'm not saying that it's false. I'm not announcing that I'm converting to becoming a Muslim, and I'm not trying to defend Christianity against that claim. I'm trying to understand what the text says. And if the Quran challenges something I believe, I'm not going to soften its words to make myself more comfortable. Just like when we encounter something that challenges Islam, I'm not going to exaggerate it to make Christianity more comfortable either. Understanding has to come before agreement or disagreement. So my question to my Muslim friends is that it's not. I'm not asking you, is the Quran right? I'm asking you, am I understanding the Quran correctly? Does this passage teach that someone who genuinely receives the earlier revelation should recognize the revelation that's given through Muhammad? And if I'm missing nuance or something else here, please teach me, because that's what I'm doing this for. Not to prove, not to convert, not to win an argument, to understand. So help me understand and go love your neighbor.